All right, hello everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and wherever you're from, and welcome to the Shutterstock library here. My name is James Gash, and I'm the manager of content review here at Shutterstock. And welcome to the live stream on preparing your first photo submission to Shutterstock. What I'd like to do in this presentation is go over some of the basic steps for selecting your first 10 photos that you submit to us, how to select them from a quality perspective, how to select them from a metadata perspective, which means when I refer to metadata, I mean titles and keywords, and then also how to select them from a compliance perspective as well. So that involves whether something needs a release, looking at your images from a legal perspective, things like that. So this is mainly geared towards new contributors with Shutterstock. However, if you already are an established contributor, you'll probably find some good tips in here, but a lot of the stuff that I am going over you may already know. So you're still welcome to join in and listen in, but this is going to be primarily geared towards new contributors who are just signing up or who are going through our newbie process on Shutterstock. So I've got a lot to go over, so let me run down an outline of some of the things I'm going to focus on. So here at Shutterstock, we have thousands of new contributors that are signing up. And we see some common mistakes from time to time that new contributors make. So hopefully by the end of this session, you won't be making those mistakes and you'll have a better idea as to what to do to prepare yourself for success. So the first thing that I'm going to touch on is the new contributor evaluation process that we have here at Shutterstock. The next thing is I'm going to talk about the general guidelines that we have, so some general things to follow when you are selecting images from your portfolio to submit. I'm going to go through the quality guidelines section. So this is probably the bulk of the presentation where I'll go through some of the frequently used rejection reasons that you'll see. And then I'll go over titles and keywords. So how to maximize your titles, how to select the appropriate keywords for your content. I'll go over compliance and releases. So this is viewing your images from a trademark compliance perspective, as well as having the appropriate releases and documentation necessary for your images. And finally, I'll touch briefly on editorial content, what we accept when it comes to editorial content, and what our requirements are when you submit editorial content. Now, I realize there's a lot of stuff in here, and my hope is in the upcoming year, we'll be doing additional live streams where we can delve into each one of these topics even further. But what I'm going to do is give you a quick overview. All right, so let's move on to the first one. But first and foremost, I just wanted to mention that we are going to have some time for Q&A at the very end. We have a moderator over here who's going to be collecting some questions. Some things, though, that this presentation is not going to address is, unfortunately, I won't be able to address individualized reviews. So I won't be able to address any reviews that you had in the past. But I can address any questions from a general perspective about what I'm going to cover. All right, so let me start off with just some general guidelines to keep in mind when you're selecting your content. First guideline, we have a minimum size requirement of 4 megapixels. Now, this is pretty conservative, so really any camera that's out there for the most part should be able to meet this general requirement. So just make sure that your images are at 4 megapixels, preferably larger than that, but 4 megapixels minimum when you're selecting what you want to submit to us. The next thing, and I can't stress this more than enough, is to inspect your images at full resolution prior to submitting. What that means is opening up your images and viewing them at 100%. This is how our reviewers look at your images. They open every single one up at 100%. So you need to do the same when you're selecting your images. And the next thing is inspect all of your images on a properly calibrated display. You don't want to look at your images on a laptop on the beach for a number of different reasons, but it's probably not going to be the best environment for you to view your photos. So the strongest advice that I can give you is when you are evaluating the photos that you want to submit, do it on a properly displayed, calibrated monitor in a situation that has appropriate lighting and things like that that's meant for viewing photos. All of our reviewers work on displays, high-resolution displays that are calibrated. So if you follow these guidelines, this is a great first step that you can make to setting yourself up for success. Be cognizant of the minimum pixel requirement, 4 megapixels. Inspect your images at full resolution, that's 100%, open them up at 100%, and then also inspect your images on a properly calibrated display. All right, so let me head into the new contributor evaluation process. So any new contributor that signs up with us at Shutterstock has to go through what we call a newbie evaluation. I know it's a little daunting at first, but the whole reason for the newbie evaluation is all about education. We want you to learn as a new contributor what is acceptable for us from a quality standpoint, from a compliance standpoint, and also what's acceptable from a metadata standpoint as well. So that is the main point of the newbie evaluation. And the way it works is you'll be asked to select 10 images, upload those images, keyword them, supply any releases that are necessary for the images, and submit them for review. And the turnaround time is pretty quick. They should get turned around within 24 hours back to you. As long as you get 7 out of those 10 approved, you're in, and you become a Shutterstock contributor. You can start submitting as much as you'd like. If you don't meet those 7 out of 10 requirements, you will have to go through the process again. And there may be a little bit of a waiting time before you can go through that process again. However, you are welcome to go through the process multiple times, and quite honestly, it is not uncommon for any new contributor to have to go through that multiple times. Some of our best contributors that we have with us have gone through that process multiple times. So it's not, it's not the end of the world if you don't get accepted right away. If you don't get accepted, please pay attention to the rejection reasons that are given and learn from those. All of the rejection reasons that we have are fairly descriptive, and will give you an idea as to what was potentially wrong with the image and why it wouldn't meet our standards. So take all of that into consideration. Learn from the rejections. Really do your best to learn from those. We have a great resource in the contributor blog where you can look up different articles that dive into the rejection reasons even further. So the review process consists of 3 parts. I like to break it down into 3 different buckets. The first bucket is the quality evaluation, and that's a highly technical quality evaluation of your photo. The second part is evaluating your image from a metadata perspective, and then the third part is evaluating your image from a compliance perspective. And I'll go into each one of these buckets in the upcoming slides. Another thing to keep in mind too is if you receive a rejection, don't take it personally. It's not meant to be a personal attack on your work. A lot of us, we're all artists, we're all creatives. We need to learn to use that information constructively, and then specifically with our content and with stock in general, we have a particular feel that we are looking for. So just because you receive a rejection, it doesn't mean your image is bad. That's not what we're trying to say. What we're trying to say is that it just does not meet the technical requirements or the metadata requirements or the compliance requirements for our collection. All right, so let me go into one of the most popular discussions all about review. I'm going to talk about some rejection reasons. So we have a large number of default rejection reasons, but we do have a couple of rejection reasons that we tend to see more often than not, in particular with newbie contributors. First one I want to focus on is the focus rejection. So the description for this rejection reason is the subject is out of focus, the focus is too soft, or the image is too blurry due to camera shake. Now I know that incorporates a lot of different things into one overall rejection. So let me go down and break down into those a little bit further. The first part, subject is out of focus. Should be pretty clear. It means that the subject is out of focus. And one of the things that you can keep in mind when you are taking photos is not to always trust the camera when it tells you something is in focus. A lot of times if you're using autofocus techniques, the camera will select an area of the image that you didn't necessarily tend to be in focus, and it selects something completely different. So this is why it's always in your best interest to view your images at full resolution before you submit so that you can notice these things, because these things might not be noticeable if you're viewing your image in a scaled down size. Also, I would highly advocate learning about more of the focal modes that you have on your camera. So learn to use the different metering modes that are available and learn to apply those to the appropriate situations. Also, don't always rely on autofocus. Manual focus will work even better for you in some situations. So learn to use those. There's a lot of great tutorials that are out there. We have some great tutorials on SkillFeed and other sites where you can learn more about how to improve your focus techniques. Another part of that focus rejection reason is the focus is too soft. Now this is often a little subjective because what is too soft and what is sharp enough. In general, if you receive a focus rejection, it could be because the focus is just we consider too soft for the image. A lot of times this has to do with the equipment that you're using. You might be bound by the type of lens that you're using, and that's the best that you can get from that lens. So we strongly advise that you use the highest quality equipment you can that's within your budget. We realize that not everybody can go out and spend thousands of dollars on new cameras and lenses, but in general, the higher quality camera you have, the higher quality lenses you have, the less issues you are going to have with soft focus. And then the last part of the focus rejection is the image is too blurry due to camera shake. Another very common thing that comes up, in particular with new contributors. Always try to use a tripod whenever necessary. If you're in a location where you can't use a tripod, you can't set one up, you can try using a monopod. Also, you can try stabilizing your camera in some creative ways. You can lean yourself up against something or try to do something like that in order to make it the most stable as possible. There are some other manual adjustments that you can make with your camera in order to cut back on this camera shake, such as increasing the ISO, or you can try a different shutter speed. So those are some things that you can do, but those things will also introduce potentially additional issues to your photo as well. So always try to remain as stable as possible when you're shooting. All right, so I've got a couple of examples. So here's a photo, and this is a scaled down photo. And when you look at it on your screen, it looks okay. It looks, the focus issues aren't necessarily apparent. They might not jump out at you. However, once we zoom in and we see it at 100%, hopefully this is portrayed appropriately to you guys out there. But you should be able to see that it definitely is too soft. And this is an image that we would consider to be out of focus, most likely due to camera shake. Here's another example, a really nicely stylized photo of a chicken pot pie. And if we zoom in at this at 100%, you can see that it does have selective focus. It's utilizing shallow depth of field, but the edge of the pot pie is definitely sharp. And that's where your eye is drawn to. That's the area of the photo where we expect the focus to be. If I go back to the scaled down version, you see there's some other objects in that scene. It looks like there's some type of a salt shaker or a decorative element that's in the upper left-hand corner. If you're relying on an autofocus technique, your camera may have hunted that down and decided that's what it wanted in focus. And if that was sharp, it wouldn't be the best focal point for this image because that's not the primary subject here. The primary subject is this delicious chicken pot pie, which is in the center of the plate. All right, the next rejection reason I want to highlight is the noise rejection reason. So the noise rejection reason description states, the image contains excessive noise, film grain, compression artifacts, and/or posterization. So let me break down into those things and tell you a little bit about what those mean. In general, when it comes to noise and ISO go hand in hand. So the higher ISO that you're shooting at, the more potential that you have to introduce noise into your photo. So try to shoot at the lowest ISO possible for the scene. Granted, we completely realize that there's going to be situations where you're going to have to shoot at a high ISO. If you're in low light, you're going to have to shoot at a higher ISO. So we take all of those issues into consideration when we do the review. So if we notice that it is a low light shot, for example, we will take that into consideration when we are evaluating the noise. But in general, try to shoot the lowest ISO possible. There are some noise reduction techniques that you can do in post-processing, but these quite often bring in additional problems to your image, which could result in another rejection reason. The other really common thing that we see, in particular with newbie contributors, is compression issues. So you want to avoid compression completely. A lot of times new photographers don't realize that there's image compression going on within the camera and you're not even aware of it. So double check your camera, make sure you're shooting at the highest resolution that's possible. And also, if at all possible, I would suggest shooting in RAW. You'll need to do some additional steps in post-processing with RAW, but it won't be compressed. So when you're shooting in JPEG, it's automatically going to be compressed. So if you are shooting in JPEG, just make sure you're shooting at the highest resolution that you possibly can. So let me show you a couple of examples with noise. So here's an image that's scaled back. And if we zoom in even closer at 100%, that's the 100% crop of this image, you can clearly see that there's noise visible in the shadows. The shadows is a great area to look for noise because noise likes to hide in the shadows. So this one would be unacceptable. This image would be rejected for excess noise. Now here's an example showing compression. It's the same image. The image on the left is straight out of the camera, and the image on the right has been compressed. So you can definitely see the differences here. The one on the left is much sharper, much more crisp. The one on the right, you can see some artifacts. It's similar to noise, but it's not quite the same. So compression artifacts definitely have a different look to it. You can see they look kind of blocky, kind of chunky, and kind of jagged, particularly in the background of the image, but also along the face of the stab, you can see the compression artifacts as well. All right, composition rejection. So this is one of our more subjective rejection reasons that we do have, and it often causes a lot of frustration with our contributors. So let me go through the description here of the compression rejection. So it means the arrangement of the subject or visual elements is not optimal. Distracting elements are entering the frame, or the horizon line is crooked. With this rejection reason, when it's given, it usually applies to distracting elements, or it applies to the horizon line is not crooked. So let me go into what you can do to avoid this. First thing first, learn the rules. Learn the basic rules of composition. Start with the rule of thirds, and I'll go into an example of what the rule of thirds is. That will give you some guidance as to how to place the elements in your scene to make it the most dynamic and balanced photo possible. Other thing is recognize the negative space. So leave your subject, give it room to breathe inside the frame of the image. Leave some space that's on the side deliberately that a customer can add copy into. A lot of our customers like to add some copy into the negative space. So keep that in mind as you're shooting as well. And then the other thing is to crop carefully. So this is always best if you frame up your photo in the very beginning within the camera, but you can do some post-processing techniques, such as cropping in post-processing, or you can also remove some of the distracting elements using a clone brush or some of the more advanced techniques from within Photoshop, but that just adds more additional work for you that you have to do, where originally if you shot the photo and just tilted it in a different way, you would avoid all of those things altogether. So crop carefully. And let me show you some examples on the next couple screens that illustrate composition rules. So this first image, this is a great representation of the rule of thirds in action. It's also a great example of negative space as well. So I'm going to put a grid overlay on this photo as well. It's kind of faint, it's some red lines. This is the rule of thirds. So we've divided the photo into a bunch of quadrants. So we have it's in the thirds vertically, it's in the thirds horizontally, and the elements of the photo are placed appropriately on those lines. And then taking into consideration the negative space, there's plenty of negative space on the left-hand side for copy, or also just gives the image, gives the subject some room to breathe. And you could see this image being used in a number of different ways. Here's another one, a cute photo of a bunny through it's like a hole in a wall. But here's a great example of showing negative space. We've got all that negative space on the left-hand side, but it's not arbitrary. It definitely balances out the image. And this image would be completely different if that bunny was centered dead straight in the center of that wall. This also utilizes the rule of thirds as well, if you were to imagine a imaginary grid line over this photo. Also with the rule of thirds, I think most all of the cameras that are out there will allow you to overlay a grid line either on your LCD display, or if you're using a digital viewfinder, you should be able to look through the viewfinder and have those grids already set up. So I would highly recommend having those set up if you're just learning it. Here's an example of some distracting elements. This is something we see very commonly. Right away, when this image popped onto your screen, your eyes probably went directly up to the tree branches, which are on the top of the image. And you can see it's right over a white sky, so it stands out even more. So something you can do with this image, preferably, is you would set it up differently, frame it up differently when you take a reshoot. But another thing you can do in post-processing is just simply crop it, crop out those distracting tree branches. Or if you're really good with cloning and want to have some fun with that, you could use some cloning tools in post-processing and try to clone out those branches. This is another example which shows the rule of thirds as well. You can see the group of sheep that are in the lower right-hand corner are on one of the thirds quadrants. All right, So now let's talk about lighting and exposure rejection. So this is another very common rejection reason. So the description for this is the image is underexposed, overexposed, or it was shot in unfavorable lighting conditions. So once again, it incorporates a number of different things. When you're thinking about lighting and exposure, pay attention to your highlights and shadows. You don't want to have images that are blown out or are just way too dark. So there are some ways that you can do this creatively, such as in low key or high key. But to start with, I would just focus on getting the most properly exposed, the most basic exposure image to begin with. Save some of the creative projects for maybe later on. So the best way to identify your exposure issues is to learn to use the histogram, as well as learn to use the levels in a post-production piece of software. So the histogram that you see, and I'll show you some examples of what a histogram is and what it looks like for images that are properly exposed and images that are over or underexposed. You can use that histogram, and as you get accustomed to using it, you'll be able to, just from looking at the histogram, be able to tell if that is a properly, evenly exposed image. And the levels adjustment is anyone who, I would recommend this to anybody who is taking up photography, learn levels right away. If it's the first thing you're going to learn in Photoshop, learn how to use levels. You can also use levels in other applications. It doesn't necessarily have to be Photoshop, but that's the one that I just default go to. So you can use, the levels box within Photoshop, and you can adjust your levels in post-processing, and you can make some adjustments to the exposure then. Quite often we see images that come in that are just so flat. If they only had a little bit of levels adjustments, they would be perfectly fine. And then the last thing, and this should be fairly obvious, is just to shoot in the best conditions possible. Taking your camera out in the midday sun at noon probably isn't the best idea. We realize, that might be the only opportunity that you get to shoot, but just know that the exposures that you're going to get from that might not be up to par with what we're expecting for our collection. All right, so here's some examples. So here's an image. It's very, very even, and if you take a look at the histogram here, you can see that. Right from the histogram, you can see the pixels are evenly distributed. It's got a really nice curve there in the histogram. There aren't a lot of super dark areas. There aren't a lot of super bright areas. So this is an example of an image and its related histogram, which is perfectly fine, perfectly acceptable. On the flip side, here's another image, which, you can tell right by the image itself that this is definitely underexposed. But if we look at the histogram, you can see it right off the bat there too. You can see it just has too much dark areas. There's even some blown out highlights in this photo as well. This is an example of one which I don't think can be recovered. So you might just want to save this one for your Facebook feed or sharing it with your friends and family at home. But you can try. I don't want to discourage anybody from trying to fix an image, but just know that this one's going to be particularly tough to improve upon. All right, so that wraps up the quality review part. So what I'm going to move into now is the metadata review part, and this pertains to titles and keywords. So titles and keywords are super important. They're the pieces of metadata that you apply to your image that helps your image get found. Quite often we do see images that come in that are really nice, but they just don't have the right titles and don't have the right keywords, and they're just never going to get found. So when we reject for titles and keywords, quite often, if it's not rejected for another technical reason, we want you to just modify those titles and keywords and resubmit, because we want customers to be able to find your image. So first things first, the title should be short but descriptive. It shouldn't contain any excess information about the name of the model. It shouldn't contain information about your name. That's all on your Shutterstock profile, so you don't need to include that in the title. You shouldn't have anything about the equipment that you used, also links to websites, things like that. And you also don't want to get very poetic with the way you're describing the image. Just keep it short, keep it descriptive. Relevancy is key in both the titles and the keywords. The more relevant keywords that you have, the better chances your image is going to get found. And you don't want to populate your image with keywords that are irrelevant, because that's just going to frustrate customers as they're searching for content. So keep your keywords relevant. You will be asked to select a minimum of 70 keywords, up to a maximum of 50 keywords. So what I suggest is to try to find that balance. Usually the sweet spot is between 25 and 45 accurate keywords. So spend some time coming up with your keywords and figuring out how you best want to describe your image. And the keywords should be a combination of descriptive keywords, but get conceptual as well. Once again, stay relevant. Relevance is key, but get conceptual. And there's somewhat easy ways that you can do this. You can use a thesaurus. A thesaurus is going to be a great tool for you. Another thing that you can use is within our content editor on Shutterstock, when you upload your content, as you're doing your keywords, you'll see there's a button for a keyword suggestion tool. And this is really cool, and I highly recommend everyone test it out. When you go there, you'll select a number of different images which look similar to your image. And then what the tool does is it'll pull together some suggested keywords for you. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that all of those keywords you need to put to your image or that all of them necessarily will apply, but it does a really great job at giving you a great place to start. You can select which keywords you want to use, and it makes the whole keywording process a lot less painful. So definitely check out that when you're in the content editor as you're preparing your content. All right, so let me go through some examples of some titles and keywords. So I'm going to show you some images. So here's a really nice image. And here's a title that was applied to this image. So, Linda loves to do yoga at the YMCA every morning. Is that a good title? Not really. This would be a nice title to use if you're sharing this image with your friends at home who know who Linda is. You're mentioning the model's name in this title. You're also mentioning the YMCA, which is a potential issue. So this would not be a good title. A better title to select for this image would be Woman Practicing Yoga in Natural Light. It's short, it's sweet, it's descriptive. Now, as far as keywords for an image like this, first and foremost, you should describe what's going on in the image. So this is a woman. She's doing yoga, or maybe perhaps some other type of exercise. She's on a mat. She's indoors. She's blonde. These are all descriptive words that you can use to describe the image. And in addition to that, like I said before, you want to get conceptual. So think of some conceptual words that you can use to describe the feeling of the image. Healthy, natural, lifestyle, peaceful, wellness. Those are just a couple of conceptual words that work for this image. Here's another example. The title for this is The Water Waits for No One. So while that's really poetic and very nice, it's not an appropriate title for us. So a better title to describe this image would be Man with Backpack Standing by a Stream. Short, sweet, descriptive. And here's some potential keywords that you can use for this image. So first step, describing what's actually in the image. We can see a man. He's got a backpack. He's outdoors. He's by a stream. These are all descriptive keywords of what's going on in the scene. Now, some conceptual keywords you can use for this. Contemplation. You might be contemplating at the edge of a stream. He might be pensive. He might be doing this for recreation. He could be hiking, he could be relaxing. These are all different conceptual words that you can use to describe what's going on in this scene. And I've got one last example. This one could prove to be a little bit more difficult with keywords, so I wanted to bring this one up. So the title for this one is simply Road. Yes, it is a road, but we'd like you to be a little bit more detailed. Yeah, that's a short title, it's to the point, but it's not as descriptive as it could be. So a better title that would work for this image is A Highway Overpass in Shanghai at Night. That's what it is. It's a highway overpass. It is in Shanghai. That's the location where it's at, and it's also at night. So that's a perfectly short, sweet, descriptive title that you can use for an image such as this. Now, some keywords, highway, overpass, cityscape, freeway. Those are all keywords that describe what's in this image. An additional conceptual can be a little difficult with an image like this, but just think of what this portrays. Energy, movement, speed, all of those things are what comes to mind when I see an image like this. So those are all definitely conceptual words that you can use to describe this. All right, so moving on from titles and keywords, I want to go into compliance and talk a little about what our compliance requirements are. So first and foremost, with compliance, visible trademarks. So you want to make sure when you're shooting images that there are no visible trademarks. And what I mean by visible trademarks are logos on shirts, in particular logos on buttons. They like to hide on buttons, belts, If someone's wearing a hat with a logo on the hat, you want to keep an eye out for all of those. Also with electronic devices, you want to make sure that there's no labels or symbols or things like that on electronic devices. So the visible trademarks you can always attempt to remove in post-production through cloning, or while you're taking the shoot, you can just decide to pose the model differently, have them take off their hat, or frame it up differently where you can't see the actual visible trademark. We have a lengthy list of restrictions, of common restrictions that we see, and we have this on the blog. We will send you a link so that you guys can take a look at all of this, but get to know this list. It is a little daunting at first because we try to cover every restriction that we are aware of, and it is a list that we're consistently adding to as well as new things come up. But most of the things that are on that list relate to brands that you might not be aware of. So for example, Burberry, the fashion company, Burberry doesn't necessarily have a logo on their stuff, but it has a definite plaid that's easily recognizable. And we wouldn't be able to take an image of a woman with a Burberry scarf visible around her. Another thing are certain locations in certain buildings. So for example, the Empire State Building, which we're in right now, if I were to take a photo of this isolated from the outside, it would not be acceptable at all. It would be a compliance issue. Certain buildings like that, yeah, there are restrictions on. So definitely check out that list. I would take a look at it before you decide to select what you want to submit. And as you read through it, you'll start to get the gist of it and start to see where it's going and start to see what to look for when it comes to these things. And lastly is the model and property releases. So any images you submit to us that have recognizable people, we need to have a model release. And the model release needs to be signed by the model or the parent/guardian. We need to have the model's contact information. And we also need to have a witness print their name and sign their name as well. And the witness, it's important that the witness is somebody that's completely separate. It needs to be a person that is observing the signing of the document. So the witness is not, it should not be the photographer, and the witness should not be the model either. For releases, we have all different kinds of template releases available on the website that you can download, but we also take releases from other agencies as long as it meets our standards is what's required in a release. And you can also use your own personal branded release as well, but just take a look at our template and make sure that your personal release matches what we have in our template release. Property releases are a little trickier, and I'll show you some examples as to when those would be necessary. But in general, with model and property releases, if you're able to get them, get them. It's not going to hurt you if you have, if you have a model release or a property release when it's technically not needed. Model release content sells really well. So in general, if you're able to get model release content, that's a plus. Property releases, similar to model releases, if you're in a private location, say you're indoors at a hotel, you would need a property release for something like that if it's a highly identifiable modern hotel. I'll show you some examples which will hopefully illustrate this a little further. So let's get into some examples. So here's a nice shot of two kids in the woods. They're both facing the camera, so we would definitely need two model releases for these children. And each model release would have to be signed by the parent guardian as well as a witness to the scene. The witness could be the same on both releases, but the witness could just not be the photographer couldn't be the witness, the guardian couldn't be the witness, and the child also couldn't be the witness either. Now, we wouldn't need a property release for the woods at all. This is a fairly generic woods. There's really nothing identifying in there that tells me where this location could be. Here's an example of a family of four with their backs facing the camera. We would not need a release in this situation because you can't see the people, so they're not discernible. So we wouldn't need a release for this one. However, chances are the photographer knows who these people are, so it would always just be in your best interest just to get them to sign that release. That way you're covered. Now moving on to property releases, which are a little bit more difficult. This shot that I have here, you can see it's a definite interior of a cafe, of a coffee shop. It has some really distinct furniture, some distinct lighting fixtures. There's a lot going on in here. It's a wide shot of a location where if the owner of this location, if the owner of this restaurant saw this, they would instantly identify it as being theirs. So in this situation, you would, where you're required to have a proper release that's signed by an authorized representative from the location. Now in this example, it's a tighter shot using selective focus just on some flowers which are placed on a bed. It could be a hotel somewhere, it could be somebody's apartment, but the background is just so the background is so blurred out that you really can't identify where this was taken. So pictures like this would be perfectly fine to submit without a property release. If you have one though, great, add it along. It's always good to have it just in case. But an image like this, we would not require a property release. In general, when it comes to property releases, the wider the shot is, the more likely you are going to have a property release. When the image is more about the room, so if I go to that other example, this whole image is about this particular place. That's the whole point of this image, so a property release would be needed. This image is more about the flowers that are placed on the bed, so it's less about the overall room that it was taken, so a release would not be needed. That's just a general rule of thumb. The wider the shot of the location, the more likely you are going to need to have a property release. Okay, and the last topic that I wanted to touch on is editorial images and what we require for editorial images. Editorial content, just in general to define what editorial content is for our site, it cannot be used to advertise or promote a product or service. The editorial content that we take is primarily newsworthy and current events. So things like concerts, parades, public events like protests, all of those are entirely appropriate for editorial. What we don't take for editorial, though, are images such as those two kids in the woods where you weren't able to obtain a model release. That's not what we would take for editorial content. So submitting as editorial should not be an excuse for not obtaining a proper model release. Editorial content, keep in mind that if it is a private venue, so say it's a private concert that you're shooting at, we may require additional credentials for that. And it's in your best interest to contact us prior to submitting that type of content and supplying the types of credentials that you had in order to shoot there. As a general rule of thumb, if it's a ticketed event or if you paid to go into that event, then more than likely it is going to require credentials. So we have a blog post which details our whole credentials policy and gives you some specific examples as to when scenarios where credentials are needed. And the last thing, and this is something that frequently throws off a lot of new contributors, is our editorial caption. The editorial caption needs to be a very specific caption versus the general caption that we have for commercial content. The editorial caption has to consist of the date, the location, and a description of what's going on in the scene. So basically, you're looking at the who, what, where of the photo, who, what, where, why of the photo. And what I'll do is show you some examples coming up that tell you how to create those captions. So here's some examples. So this image right here, if it was submitted as editorial and the caption was "Soldiers Salute," that's not good enough for an editorial image with us. This would get rejected for needing an appropriate caption. Here's a better caption. New York, May 23rd, 2014, U.S. Marines salute during the reenlistment and promotion ceremony at the National September 11th Memorial Site. Now, why is this good? It tells us who is in this photo. We've got Marines in there. Why? Well, they're at a reenlistment and promotion ceremony. Where is it at? It's at New York. And when was it? March 23rd, 2014. Here's another example. The title caption that was supplied here was "Pillow Fight." This would be rejected. That's not an appropriate caption for this photo. An appropriate caption would be "Amsterdam, the Netherlands, Noord-Holland, Saturday, April 4th, 2015. Pillow fight on Dam Square as part of the International Pillow Fight Day, held in several cities around the world." So that's a great editorial caption. It's got the who are the people. It's got what, it has International Pillow Fight Day, where, it's taken in Amsterdam, and when, April 4th, 2015. And then lastly, here's another example for you. So a caption that was supplied could have been "Male vocalist at a concert," not descriptive enough. Here's a better caption. Prague, February 12th, British singer Ed Sheeran during his performance at Forum Karlin in Prague, Czech Republic, February 12th, 2015. I'm sorry I mispronounced Forum Karlin, but I think I may have got it right, hopefully. So who is this? It's Ed Sheeran. What is it? It's a performance at Forum Parliament. Where is it? It's in Prague. And when is it? It was on February 12th, 2015. These are all great pieces of information. Now, this image would need credentials. This is a perfect example of an image that we would require credentials. It's a private concert. You can tell by the photo that the photographer definitely had some type of special access to take this photo. So a good rule of thumb, like I said before, is that if it's a ticketed event or it's an event that you have to pay to get in, you are going to need credentials. But to go into our, to learn more about our credential policy in detail, you can go to our contributor blog. We have a whole post up there about credentials. And you could also contact our support department and ask if the credentials that you have would be appropriate for the content that you want to submit. And that about wraps things up. I know I went through a lot of different information in there, and I really just touched on the surface of a lot of these things. Like I said, I hope in the upcoming year we can delve into these a little bit further. We could probably do a whole live stream just based on editorial content alone. But I wanted to go over some helpful links that you can use. And these, I believe, were sent out prior to the live stream, but we have a great post up there about 19 common newbie submission mistakes that you can easily avoid. Highly recommend reading through that. A lot of the things that I discussed in this live stream are reiterated in that post. The known image restrictions, I bookmark that, bookmark it and look at it, read through it, get familiar with it, because that's going to be a really great tool, a really great resource for you in determining what you want to select to submit to us. And then the other thing is our editorial submission tips. So in our editorial submission tips, we give you information about creating the captions. We also give you information about the credentials policy. So definitely take a look at that if you're potentially interested in submitting editorial content to us. So thank you. I have some time for some questions. I have a moderator over here who's got some questions for me. So if we want to start it off.
Right. We had a question about using foreign keywords or keywords in different languages. Should contributors use them or?
Currently, the keywords in the title should be in English. So we are working on improving that process to be able to accept foreign keywords and foreign titles. But for now, please submit your keywords and titles in English. I realize that that's restrictive, and I apologize for that. And like I said, we are working on improvements for that process.
Any tips on submitting an HDR black white images?
Yeah, I mean we take both both of those types of content. We take HDR, we take black and white. We have a great blog post talking about HDR in general. With HDR, it's very easy for people to go overboard with it, and it's very easy to introduce noise and pixelization and artifacts when you're attempting to do HDR. So just be careful with that. When you first read about it, it seems like it's a pretty easy thing to do, but once you start to dive into it, it can get a little bit more difficult. But our review team can recognize when something is done in HDR, and so they'll take that into consideration when they are evaluating your content.
The contributor had a question about earlier when you were talking about focus. They wanted to reference skill feed. Is that a good resource for them to find tips on focus and kind of general?
I believe there are photography tips on SkillFeed. Okay, so I might stand corrected, but I know SkillFeed has got a ton of new tutorial videos and things like that, and I believe there are photography tutorials that are on there. So I think that is a great resource to utilize. There's also lots of other, if you just Google, there's lots of other different places where you can find some free information as well.
Restriction, like one contributor has a question about build-ins that may be protected. Is there a way that on this study could maybe reference?
Yeah, sorry, I just realized I'm not repeating the questions that he's telling at me. So the question was about restricted buildings, so a list of what particular buildings are restricted, and that's that known image restrictions list that I was referencing earlier. That's where we're going to have like the specific buildings that are restricted. But just know that that's not all inclusive. We cannot possibly list every single scenario. When it comes to buildings, the more modern the building looks and the tighter shot it is, the more of a potential that it could be a problem. So I would avoid taking tight shots of modern buildings. Wide shots, cityscapes, those should be perfectly fine, but modern buildings, tight shots, I would avoid. And we have some more details about that specifically in the known image restrictions. Unless you're able to get a property release. If you're able to get a property release, be my guest and try to get that property release, and if you're able to supply that, then it should be fine.
Sorry. One contributor has a question, or they would like you to elaborate on what a calibrated screen is, how you should go about doing that.
Okay. The question was around screen calibration. So there's different tools that you can purchase, and they're relatively inexpensive. You can pay about $100 or so to get a screen calibrator, and I would recommend using that on a routine basis. It's something that attaches to your screen, and you set it up via the application on your computer, and it'll take light samples from where you're sitting, and it'll determine what's the best calibration for your screen. There's also some internal calibrations on a lot of the, I know I work on a Mac, there's some internal calibration techniques that are built into that you can use as well, but I don't think it quite meets up with purchasing a dedicated calibrator itself. One of them, I believe, is a spider calibrator you could use. There's a lot of them that are online, and like I said, they are relatively inexpensive, so you don't have to invest a whole lot into those.
The one contributor has a question about what they should submit for their, they came up with general suggestions on what kind of content they should submit for their first submission.
Great question.
Great question.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is about what type of topics and categories they should submit for their first 10. I can tell you some things that we definitely have a lot of in our collection. We have a lot of clouds, we have a lot of butterflies, we have a lot of cats, and those are people's pets. So those are topics that I would say to avoid. I would focus on kind of more, if you're living in a location which isn't, search on the site. If you're living in a location where you don't see a lot of content represented from your city or from your town, you can go out and shoot different things around there. And you can also look on the site and do some searches and see what we might have gaps in our collection. And if you don't get a lot of search results, then you can focus on something like that. But I would avoid flowers for your first 10 submissions, unless you're shooting spectacular flowers and you know the scientific names for all of them. I would avoid butterflies. I would avoid clouds. And I would avoid your lunch unless you can properly set it up and light it well. But it's not to say that we don't have any types of content that we're saying no more. We're still taking clouds. We'll accept clouds on a day-to-day basis, but I wouldn't advise shooting something like that for your first initial submission with us.
How do the missions also should be the same topic for?
Okay. So another part of the question was that should it be the same topic, or should you give a range of different topics? I would advise giving a range of different topics, and I wouldn't shoot all the same thing. So if you could, show us a range of the type of content that you would like to submit to us. That gives us a great overall view of what we can expect from your future submissions. And also just in general, just to reiterate what I said earlier, model release content is great. So if you're able to get model releases, that definitely helps you to be able to get accepted. So if you're able to get model release content, definitely do that. And you can shoot, you shoot your kids, your neighbors, your family members, in their day-to-day routines, day-to-day activities. Maybe cooking dinner, taking kids to school, things like that. Yeah, I think those would be great things to submit. And easy to get model releases from. You don't have to hire them.
Question about model releases. Should there be a model release just for each photo, or can you use the same model release for multiple photos?
Okay, question about model releases. So can you use the same model release for multiple photos? So say you have 10 photos and the same model is used in all 10 of those photos, but it's a different scene. It's fine to use the same model release for each one. So you don't have to get the model to sign a brand new release for each image.
I'm guessing this contributor is talking about using keyword phrases.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts about that? How do they supply keyword phrases to
Okay, so the question was about using keyword phrases. So for example, using the phrase healthy lifestyle, you can include that as a phrase, just put it in quotes when you're entering it into the content editor, and it'll recognize it as a phrase. What I don't think you should do is get very elaborate with your phrases. So you don't want to use a phrase such as, healthy lifestyle in California, because the chances that somebody is going to be searching for that specific string is going to be kind of rare. So I would be a little careful with using phrases, but we do take them. It's fine. Because the thing with the phrases is they're going to be searching for that specific phrase, so it kind of pigeonholes you a little bit into if someone is specifically searching for that, are they going to be able to find it?
Contributor wants to know. He's asking, I'm a contributor to another stock agency. Can I submit these images?
Okay, so the question was about, I'm a contributor to another agency. Can I submit these images? Just check to make sure that you're not exclusive with that agency. So as long as you're not exclusive, then it's perfectly fine. You can submit those to us. The releases, we should be able to take those as well. If they do have releases assigned to them, just double check on our site, on our template releases, and make sure that all the information is represented in your release that you used on the other site. So as long as you're not exclusive, then that's fine. You can submit your content to us. Doesn't necessarily guarantee that it'll get approved in our collection, but it's definitely a good indicator that another agency had wanted that photo. And we don't have exclusivity here at Shutterstock either. So you're welcome to submit whatever you submitted to us to other agencies if you'd like.
I want to know, should we also add ISO, shutter speed, f-stop, all this information in the description?
Okay, the question was about adding specific information about the shot into the description. So the ISO, the shutter speed, maybe the f-stop. No, don't include those in the description at all. But what you could include though is the overall effect that those settings apply to this. So adding something like selective focus or shallow depth of field, those would all be fine to add into the description. But I would avoid adding specific information about camera settings as to how you shot it.
We have a question about submitting vintage content.
Question about vintage content, which is always kind of tricky for us.
Can you let me know if you're shooting vintage items? When do they need a model release?
Okay. So the question was about shooting vintage items, and what I guess that means is it vintage photos? We're talking about scans of vintage photos.
That's what I'm assuming, yes. Or images may be in public domain.
Okay.
The second part it says when companies are still working.
Yeah. Well, we're currently not accepting any content that's in the public domain, so don't submit anything like that. But say it's an old photo that your grandfather shot. And you'd like to scan that and submit it to us. We do have specific guidelines regarding vintage content. And I know it is a little lengthy, so I don't want to talk to it and then give out the wrong information, but I believe we have correct me if I'm wrong, I believe we have a blog post that's specifically stating vintage content.
Yeah, I believe there's a knowledge base.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I'm giving the right information. So when it comes to vintage content, there is some specific rules that you have to follow as far as getting releases for, if it's a photo you didn't take, it might require a property release, and it also might require a model release as well for the models that are in the photo. But we also realize that some of those models may be deceased. It may be a really old photo and you're just not able to get those releases anymore. So there's a lot of little nuances with that. So if you are submitting that type of content, check out our contributor blog. And there should be a post in there about vintage content. If there isn't, because I can't 100% guarantee that there is or not, you can just contact support or go to the knowledge base. If you're familiar with how to access the knowledge base, there might be a knowledge base article in there about vintage content. But you can contact our support department, and we can, they can reiterate to you the specific rules you need to follow if you are submitting that type of content.
What's the address for
You're quizzing me. Submit at shutterstock.com. I got it. Right. I know my email address, so submit at shutterstock.com. That's the address that you can write to with any support-related questions. Contributor support-related questions, I should say.
Someone wants to know if they, on the first submission, they get 4 approved, and on their second attempt, they get 3 approved. Can they resubmit all 7 that have been approved?
Yeah.
The third attempt?
It's a great question. So the scenario is, I submit 10 photos, 4 of those are approved. The next time I submit 10 photos, 3 of those are approved. Can I combine the 4 with the 3 in my third attempt, and will I be guaranteed approval? We will take into consideration the content that was approved prior. However, if there is a trademark issue or a release issue, we won't be able to accept that content again, even though it may have been accepted prior. So we will take that into consideration, that it was something that was previously marked as approved by one of our reviewers, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee. I always encourage new contributors to submit 10 fresh photos with their new attempt, but you're definitely welcome to do that. If those are, if you have a small group of photos that you're pulling from, you're definitely welcome to do that, and we will take that into consideration when we're evaluating your new submission of 10 fresh images, 10 images consisting of ones that were approved in prior attempts.
Contributor wants to know if they should submit raw or JPEG images.
Okay. Contributor wants to know if they should submit raw or JPEG images. Right now we don't take raw, so you're going to have to convert them down to JPEG to submit to us.
Next question. Can you submit photos of groups and crowds without model releases? For example, shots of an intersection or an everyday streetlight.
Okay, good question. Can you submit photos of crowd scenes, such as like in a street setting, without model releases, and how would you submit that type of content? We live in, I don't necessarily live in New York City or in the Empire State Building, but in this area, there's a lot of opportunities for crowd scenes, there's a lot of activity, a lot of action going on, and that some of you might be in particular, similar cities where there's a lot of action and stuff to shoot. That's perfectly fine. If you want to shoot a crowd scene, where obviously you're not going to be able to get a model release from every single person that's in there, and you're probably not going to be able to remove every single brand name or store name that's in there. So you can submit those, but you'd have to submit them as editorial, and you would have to go through the caption policy. So make sure you list in your title the date that it was shot, where it was shot, and then a short description of what's going on in the scene. But those would be fine as editorial.
Can people submit? Should they only submit color photos, or can they also submit black and white?
Okay. Question was about should we submit color photos and black and white, or color photos or black and white versions of the color
photos, or should they submit? Can they submit both versions?
You can submit both. So you can submit a color version. You can submit a black and white version. That would be fine. Yeah, that would be fine. So if you want to submit a color version and also black and white, that's okay.
There's a question about property releases and pets. Are they required?
Okay, good one. Question about property releases and pets. In general, no, unless it's something like a racehorse or a lassie. I don't think lassie is still alive anymore, unfortunately, but unless it's a well-known animal. Grumpy cat. There you go. Perfectly good example. Grumpy cat. Yeah, you need a property release for grumpy cat. So unless it's a well-known animal, if it's just your family pet or your neighbor's pet, that would be fine. Yeah, we wouldn't need a property release for those. Same for any types of animals. Lizards, fish. Maybe Shamu, he might need a property release.
Credentials question.
Okay.
Are credentials needed for, say, for example, let's say a training camp of an NFL team?
Okay. So are credentials needed for photos of a training camp?
Just no ticket required, no entry.
There's no ticket required, but there's no entry fee, and it's a training camp, NFL team. I am going to lean towards yes, credentials will be needed for something like that, because even though it's a free event and there's no entry fee involved for it, it's probably going to be taking place in a private venue or a private location. So I would check with whoever is running that event, run it by them, say, hey, I'm taking some photos here, I'd like to submit them to Shutterstock. Is that okay, or do I need any additional information from you in order to do that? And then I would also contact our support department and explain to them the situation, and they'd be able to give you a more direct response as to whether those credentials are okay.
I would mention that we have the archive of all the old videos on the blog. People asked about vector illustration.
Sure. So yeah, we've got a large archive, a large library of old previous live stream events that we have on the blog. so you're welcome to access those. There's some that are specific about vectors and illustrations. So this one just touched on photos, but there's also some definite things that you need to keep in mind if you decide to submit vectors and illustrations. So there's one in there. There's also one about protecting your content. A member of our compliance team did that one, so I recommend viewing that one as well. And then we had one that was all about, what to submit and what to shoot. So there's a great live stream that you can view about that one as well. So those are all in the blog, so you can take a look and spend hours watching them. Okay, all right, great. Thanks everybody. Hopefully this was helpful for everybody out there. Thanks for the time, and hopefully you learned a lot. And looking forward to seeing your content and seeing you all sign up. So thanks again, and have a great day.